With the rise of industrialization, the thought of leaving domestic life in favor of the public sphere began to take root in the minds of many white women. Throughout the Progressive era, they attempted to expand the confines of domestic life. By contributing to progressive movements, they strived to empower themselves while working under the guise of helping all women. The temperance, suffrage, and feminist movements began to create great change in American life. But why then? And what were they actually trying to accomplish? What did they all have in common? And what really changed for America?
The most obvious connection between these three movements is the timing. Why was there a spike in women becoming involved in reform in America between 1890 through the 1920s? The answer to this might surprise you. Socialism. We spoke with Professor Beverly Gage from Yale University, who studies social movements in the Gilded Age and the turn of the century.
During the late 19th and early 20th century, it's sort of the heyday of the socialist movement in the United States. There was an idea that something really important had happened once industrial capitalism came along, that before you had mostly men kind of working outside the home for wages, you had a sort of family economy in which women were contributing, men were contributing. It was sort of a household economy. And that one of the things that had happened was that when men went outside the home, women's labor then became really devalued because it wasn't wage labor. And so there was a lot of conversation around that and what it meant and what the links between, say, capitalism and, they wouldn't have used the term, but we would say patriarchy really were.
In summary, socialism was an out of domestic life. It also recognized the oppression that men and capitalism forced on women. Because socialism was on the rise in this time, women's reform began to grow as well. Middle-class and wealthy urban white women began to organize in order to fight for improving their condition in home life and expanding their opportunities in the public sphere. These women succeeded in expanding their own rights in an extraordinary effort that spanned the nation. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, among many others, were charismatic and passionate leaders of protest that would eventually form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Despite the public backlash towards the suffrage movement that was manifested in artwork that demonized and tainted the image of suffragettes, they continued to fight for the right to vote. Groups like the National League for Opposition to Women's Suffrage tried to appeal to women by portraying anti-suffragists as more proper. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton also took part in the temperance and birth control movement, which introduced a radically new idea of women having more control over their bodies and domestic life. Even close to home, at Rosemary Hall, Caroline Roots Reese, the headmistress at the time, advocated for important change in the role of the American women. She believed that, and I quote, "The more capable women that run for office, the better. Women are far more interested in doing things and changing and improving conditions." Roots Reese believed in a world where women had the right to vote, and every girl had the opportunity to go through a rigorous academic experience, get a college degree, and enter the labor force.
She showed her passionate support of the suffrage movement by traveling to D.C. with 100 other Connecticut women to march for women's rights. While these nationwide movements were extraordinary and helped the lives of millions of women throughout the nation, there was still a class of women that was largely neglected. Impoverished women still faced a reality similar to that of Maggie and Maggie, a girl of the streets. Maggie is forced along a narrow path due to her gender and economic situation. Despite her best efforts, she essentially becomes a replica of all the other women in the tenement house. There was no way out for her. The average lower-class woman living in a rural area would likely still be forced by social pressure or economic need created by heavy discrimination in the public sphere to marry and live out the rest of her days as a housewife. All of this hardship is without the component of race involved. The reform movements of the 1890s through the 1920s predominantly ignored women of color. As historian David J. Diner said, "For African Americans, the last decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century seemed in many respects the worst of times. Many women of color were eager to join the suffrage and temperance movements. However, within these movements they faced discrimination and were even rejected from certain branches due to racial prejudices. Different reform movements led by women were often at odds with each other because of the issue of race. Frances Willard, the daughter of an abolitionist, often used racism to support the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the organization she was president of. Willard even said in an interview, "Better whiskey and more of it is the rallying cry of great dark-faced mobs." Prominent anti-lynching journalist Ida B. Wells called Willard out on her fueling of the fire of lynchings in the South. Even though both women supported the others' reform movement, sacrifices were often made by white women for the advancement of themselves, rather than for all women. For the poor and people of color, much stayed the same.
The feminist movement was multifaceted. Different branches had different goals. Some wanted more sexual freedom for women, some wanted increased access to jobs, and others simply wanted more freedom in their choice of clothes.
On the surface level, the birth control movement promoted reproductive rights for women and gave impoverished communities a way to limit their children and improve maternal health. Margaret Sanger, most known for her work in starting Planned Parenthood, was a fierce advocate for birth control. Sanger published a magazine called the Birth Control Review, which aimed to educate women on different forms of birth control. For many women, the only way to learn about their reproductive health was through this magazine, although it was illegal at the time. For many white women, the birth control movement was an opportunity for increased sexual freedom and family planning. Some champions of the birth control movement, however, had ulterior motives, deeply rooted in racism, white supremacy, and conservative social Darwinism. Some doctors and birth control reformers believed in eugenics, the practice of limiting a population to a select few through breeding. These reformers focused on providing disabled women and women of color with birth control in the hopes that they would fail to reproduce. More children from the fit, less from the unfit, read one article of Sanger's magazine. Sanger's message was flawed, but her methods in attempt to reach the masses were successful. Literature was a powerful tool, used to educate society on certain issues. Because of the moving power of literature, many stories and poems at the time affected how the public viewed issues. Nellie Bly's 10 Days in a Madhouse and Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper both worked to draw focus to how women with mental health issues were treated. The Yellow Wallpaper was a harsh commentary on the effects of the commonly prescribed rest cure. As the main character becomes increasingly unstable, those in positions of power continue to ignore her. This short story had a profound effect on many middle-class women who were similar to the protagonist. The story raised issues that many had never before considered and showed the harmful side of mental health treatments. Nellie Bly purposefully committed herself to an insane asylum and spent the rest of her time there acting perfectly sane. The staff at the asylum, however, refused to release her and kept her chained up. Bly wrote about this experience in a book that shocked the American public. Together, these two stories help bring awareness to the plights of mentally ill women.
These movements were successful in what they set out to accomplish. In 1919, the 18th Amendment implemented prohibition in the United States. In 1920, women got the right to vote, and in 1923, the first legal birth control clinic opened its doors in New York City. But the fight for women's rights is still ongoing. Think of the tense political discussion around abortion rights and birth control access. The Me Too movement has also had some success in fighting for women who have been sexually harassed. The Equal Rights Amendment has recently been ratified in Virginia, and there's hope that it will be implemented soon. But wealthy white women still benefit more from these conversations than poor women and women of color. Historically, women's reform has been an exclusionary movement. Even today, there's controversy around the Women's March movement and their exclusion of Jewish women. But now, more than ever, the message of inclusivity and equality flourishes across the country in order to reform the role of women in America. Thank you.